"Scum like you has no business in a house of justice." Those words would destroy Officer Mark Sullivan's entire life in the most brutal way imaginable. Judge Evelyn Monroe approached the courthouse steps in her civilian clothes, a leather briefcase containing today's case files clutched in her hand. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps as Evelyn walked with the measured pace of someone who had made this journey thousands of times before. Inside her briefcase were judicial orders she had personally signed, case files she had personally reviewed, and administrative documents that bore her official seal. But Officer Mark Sullivan saw none of these details. He saw only what his prejudice allowed him to see. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Sullivan emerged from behind a concrete pillar, his badge catching the morning sunlight. At 6'2" and 240 lb, he was an imposing figure who had learned to use his size as a weapon. His 12 years on the force had taught him that intimidation was often more effective than actual police work. Another hood rat thinking she can waltz into government property. He sneered, blocking Evelyn's path with his massive frame, his eyes fixed on her professional briefcase with contempt rather than curiosity. "This ain't no welfare office, sweetheart. You lost or just looking for trouble?" Evelyn stopped walking, her expression calm but alert. She had dealt with difficult people throughout her 23 years on the bench. But this was different. This was personal hatred masquerading as law enforcement, and she recognized the danger immediately. "Excuse me, officer," she replied politely, adjusting her grip on the briefcase. "I'm here on official business. If you'd like to see my identification, official business." Sullivan's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Lady, the only business you got here is the kind that lands you in handcuffs. This is a federal courthouse, not some community center where you can just wander around causing problems." His voice carried the authority of someone who had never been challenged, never been held accountable, never faced consequences for his actions. Other officers, Miller and Reed, emerged from nearby positions, drawn by the confrontation like sharks sensing blood in the water. "She thinks she belongs here, Sullivan," Officer Miller called out, already pulling out his phone to record what he assumed would be another routine humiliation. "These people never learn, do they?" Sullivan's eyes gleamed with the kind of hatred that had been festering for years, waiting for the perfect victim. "Official business," he repeated mockingly. "Let me guess. You're a lawyer, a judge, maybe a senator." His voice dripped with sarcasm. That's what they all claim when they get caught where they don't belong. Evelyn felt the familiar weight of systemic racism bearing down on her, but she maintained her composure. "Officer, I simply need to enter the courthouse if you'd examine my credentials. The only credentials you need are an arrest record." Sullivan snarled, stepping closer. "And you're about to get one." What happened next would be recorded by multiple security cameras, preserved forever as evidence of the moment when Officer Mark Sullivan committed the biggest mistake of his entire life. His open palm cracked across Evelyn's face with such force that her head snapped sideways. The expensive briefcase flew from her grip. Legal documents and judicial orders scattering across the stone steps like evidence of his future destruction. The sound of the impact echoed off the courthouse walls, a sharp crack that would soon echo through his nightmares. Sullivan grabbed her throat with his massive hand, his fingers digging into her neck as he slammed her back against the courthouse wall. The bronze nameplate 20F2 above them read, "The Honorable Judge E. Monroe presiding." But Sullivan was too blinded by his own prejudice to notice the cosmic irony of his actions. "Scum like you has no business in a house of justice," he growled, his face inches from hers. Spittle flew from his lips as he spoke, his hatred raw and undisguised. "Time to learn some respect for law and order." Metal handcuffs bit into Evelyn's wrists as he twisted her arms behind her back with unnecessary force. The other officers circled like vultures, their phones recording what they thought was routine police work. They had no idea they were documenting the arrest of a federal judge, creating evidence that would soon destroy all their careers. Another uppity one, thinking she can just walk into any building she wants. Officer Reed laughed, kicking at the scattered legal documents. Look at all this fake paperwork. These criminals are getting more creative with their scams. Evelyn's jaw throbbed where Sullivan's hand had connected, but her mind remained sharp and focused. She was 15 FT from her own courtroom, being brutalized by officers who would soon learn exactly who controlled their professional destiny. The irony was suffocating, but Sullivan was about to discover that justice has its own way of correcting imbalances. As Sullivan dragged her up the courthouse steps, Evelyn took mental notes of every face, every laugh, every person who would soon learn the true meaning of accountability. Inside the courthouse, Sullivan felt the familiar rush of power that came with a successful arrest. Every eye was on him. Every whisper was about his latest demonstration of authority. Security guards nodded approvingly. Court clerk stepped aside with respectful deference. This was his domain, his kingdom, and he had just reminded everyone who was really in charge. "Another one for processing, Sergeant Grant," Sullivan announced to the desk sergeant, his chest puffed with pride. The adrenaline was still pumping through his veins, making him feel invincible. Attempted breach of courthouse security, resisting arrest, assault on a police officer. Sergeant Grant barely looked up from his paperwork. After 15 years of processing Sullivan's arrests, this was just another routine booking. Same old story, different day. What's the background on this one? Subject was acting suspiciously around the courthouse entrance, Sullivan began, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had never been questioned. Carrying what appeared to be forged legal documents, claimed to have legitimate business in the building. When I attempted to verify her identity, she became combative and physically aggressive. The lies flowed from his mouth like water, each fabrication building on the last, to create a narrative that fit perfectly with his prejudices and the system's expectations. Sullivan had perfected this art over 12 years of police work, learning exactly which details to emphasize and which to omit. In the courthouse holding area, Evelyn sat quietly on a metal bench, her professional clothes wrinkled from Sullivan's assault. The handcuffs were too tight, cutting off circulation to her fingers. But she had experienced worse discomfort during her years as a federal prosecutor. Her mind was racing through the legal implications of what was happening, cataloging every violation of procedure and constitutional right. She thought about the Supreme Court cases that applied to her situation. Terry v. Ohio regarding reasonable suspicion. Miranda v. Arizona regarding her rights during arrest. Brady v. Maryland regarding the preservation of evidence. As a federal judge with 23 years of experience, she had presided over thousands of cases involving police misconduct. She had sentenced countless defendants, listened to endless testimonies, and witnessed the full spectrum of human behavior. But she had never experienced the system from this side, never felt the dehumanizing weight of being processed like a common criminal, never sat in a cell wondering if justice would prevail or if corruption would triumph once again. The irony of her situation was almost overwhelming. Sullivan had assaulted a federal judge 20 FT from her own courtroom. He had destroyed legal documents that she had personally authored and signed. He had handcuffed the woman who had the constitutional authority to sentence him to decades in federal prison. Her phone confiscated during the arrest contained direct numbers to the FBI Civil Rights Division, the Attorney General's office, and every major legal authority in the state. Her briefcase, now tagged as evidence in Sullivan's fabricated case, contained sensitive judicial documents that only a sitting federal judge would have legitimate access to. But most importantly, Sullivan was about to commit perjury in front of the one person who had both the power and the knowledge to destroy his entire career with a single revelation. If you believe no one should suffer discrimination like this, type justice in the comments below. Sullivan's got another live one, Officer Reed announced to the gathering crowd of law enforcement. This one was particularly delusional, claimed to be some kind of judge or lawyer, had a whole briefcase full of fake documents to support her story. Officer Miller laughed as he scrolled through the video on his phone. These people watch too much TV. They think if they act professional and use big words, we'll just let them walk into any building they want. Doesn't work that way in the real world. The casual racism in their conversation was breathtaking in its openness. Years of unchecked authority had made them comfortable expressing their prejudices publicly, confident that the system would always protect them regardless of their actions. "What's the usual outcome for cases like this?" asked a young officer who was new to the courthouse detail. "Open and shut," Sullivan replied confidently. "Judge will see right through her act. These people always get the maximum sentence because they waste everyone's time with their soba stories and false accusations. The system doesn't tolerate this kind of disrespect." Sullivan had no idea that the system he was referring to was embodied by the woman sitting in handcuffs just 20 FT away. He had no idea that his victim was actually the person who controlled every aspect of his professional life, from the warrants he requested to the testimony he gave to the cases he built. As the processing continued, Evelyn remained perfectly calm, but anyone looking closely would have noticed the slight upturn at the corners of her mouth. She was taking mental notes of every detail, every violation, every word that would soon be used as evidence in the federal prosecution that would destroy Sullivan's life. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and he had no idea the trap was already being set. In the courthouse's administrative wing, Sullivan began crafting the narrative that would make or break his case. This was an art form he had perfected over 12 years of police work, the delicate balance of truth and fiction that transformed messy reality into clean legal proceedings. The key was confidence, specific details that couldn't be easily verified, and a story that fit perfectly with the prejudices and expectations of judges and prosecutors. Sullivan had learned that the system was designed to believe police officers, especially when those officers were testifying against defendants who looked like Evelyn Monroe. "Let me walk you through the incident report," Sullivan said to prosecutor Karen Hayes, a middle-aged woman who had worked with him on dozens of cases over the years. Subject approached the courthouse at approximately 8:45 a.m., displaying suspicious behavior consistent with attempted security breach. Hayes nodded approvingly as she took notes. Sullivan's arrests had an impressive conviction rate, and she had learned to trust his judgment about these matters. His cases were always well documented, his testimony was always credible, and his arrests usually resulted in guilty pleas that kept her case load manageable. "What specific behaviors did you observe?" Hayes asked, her pen poised to capture the details that would become the foundation of the prosecution's case. "Subject was dressed inappropriately for legitimate court business," Sullivan began, his voice taking on the professional tone he used for official reports. She was carrying an expensive briefcase that appeared inconsistent with her socioeconomic status, suggesting possible theft or fraud. Each lie was carefully calculated, designed to plant seeds of doubt about Evelyn's credibility, while reinforcing stereotypes that would make the prosecutor and judge more likely to accept his version of events. When I approached to investigate, the subject became increasingly agitated and verbally abusive. She claimed to have legitimate business in the courthouse, but refused to provide proper identification when requested. Sullivan pulled out his notebook, flipping to a page where he had hastily scribbled fabricated details during the booking process. Subject made several threatening statements, including claims that I would regret stopping her, and that I didn't know who I was dealing with. Classic deflection tactics we see from repeat offenders. The irony of that last statement was so profound, it was almost suffocating. Sullivan was absolutely correct that he didn't know who he was dealing with, but not in the way he intended. "Did the subject attempt to flee when you tried to detain her?" Hayes asked, already anticipating the standard elements that would need to be proven in court. "Absolutely. When I attempted to place her in protective custody for everyone's safety, she became physically combative. She swung at my face, attempted to kick me, and actively resisted being handcuffed. I was forced to use the minimum necessary force to subdue her aggressive behavior." Sullivan's fabrication was becoming more elaborate with each sentence, transforming his brutal assault into a heroic act of self-defense. He had told similar stories so many times that the lies came naturally, flowing from his mouth with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged. Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Evelyn was using her legal knowledge to analyze every aspect of her situation. As a former federal prosecutor who had specialized in civil rights cases, she understood exactly what Sullivan was trying to accomplish with his false narrative. She also understood something Sullivan didn't. Every lie he told under oath would become evidence in the federal prosecution that would soon destroy his career. Perjury was a serious felony, especially when committed by a law enforcement officer in the commission of other crimes. Her phone calls during booking had been monitored and recorded, as was standard procedure. But Sullivan had no idea that Evelyn's first call had been to Chief Judge Eleanor Vance, alerting her to preserve all surveillance footage from the courthouse cameras. Her second call had been to the FBI Civil Rights Division, formally requesting an investigation into Sullivan's conduct. The federal machinery of justice was already in motion, but Sullivan was too focused on his immediate tactical victory to recognize the strategic disaster he was creating for himself. "What about the documents she was carrying?" Hayes asked, flipping through the evidence photos. "Clearly forged," Sullivan replied without hesitation. "Legal papers, case files, judicial memoranda, materials that no ordinary citizen would have legitimate access to. We believe she was planning some kind of identity theft or fraud scheme, possibly targeting court personnel. The documents were, of course, completely authentic. Evelyn had personally authored most of them, signed them, and filed them through official channels, but Sullivan's prejudice made it impossible for him to recognize obvious signs of authenticity. This appears to be a clear-cut case," Hayes concluded, closing her folder with satisfaction. "Trespassing, assault on a police officer, resisting arrest, and attempted fraud. The defendant's claims about being a judge or lawyer are obviously desperate attempts to avoid accountability." Sullivan smiled with grim satisfaction. Another case. Another victory. Another reminder that the system worked exactly the way it was supposed to. People knew their place, or they learned it the hard way. He had no idea that in a few hours he would learn exactly what his place was in the hierarchy of justice. The temporary courtroom was packed with the usual morning crowd of lawyers, defendants, court staff, and curious observers drawn by whispers of an unusual case. Judge Lawrence Kent, filling in for the mysteriously absent Judge Monroe, called the session to order with the efficient manner of someone accustomed to handling routine criminal matters. Judge Kent was a thin, pale man in his 60s who prided himself on running an efficient courtroom. He had been told that Judge Monroe was dealing with an emergency situation and would be unavailable for the morning docket. But he had no idea that the emergency was currently sitting in handcuffs at the defendant's table. Case number 2024, CR 8847. The clerk announced with practiced monotony, State versus Jane Doe defendant. The use of Jane Doe was another calculated insult. Despite Evelyn's attempts to provide proper identification, Sullivan had listed her as an unknown subject, further dehumanizing her and reinforcing the narrative that she was exactly the kind of person who belonged in the defendant's chair. Officer Mark Sullivan approached the witness stand with the supreme confidence of a man who had testified hundreds of times without ever being seriously challenged. His uniform was pressed to military precision, his badge polished to a brilliant shine, and his bearing projected the kind of professional authority that judges and juries found immediately credible. He had learned over 12 years of police work that perception was often more important than reality in courtroom proceedings. A confident officer with a compelling narrative could overcome almost any defense, especially when the defendant fit certain demographic profiles that made judges and prosecutors predisposed to believe the worst. Officer Sullivan, Prosecutor Karen Hayes, began, her voice carrying the respectful tone that law enforcement officers had learned to expect from the justice system. Please tell the court about the events that led to this arrest. Sullivan cleared his throat and settled into his testimony with the practiced ease of a professional performer. Every gesture was calculated. Every pause was deliberate. Every detail was designed to reinforce his credibility while undermining Evelyn's. Your Honor, at approximately 8:45 this morning, I was conducting routine security protocols at the courthouse entrance when I observed the defendant engaging in suspicious behavior consistent with attempted unauthorized access to government property. In the defendant's chair, Evelyn sat perfectly still, her handcuffed hands folded in her lap despite the metal restraints. The bruise on her cheek from Sullivan's assault was clearly visible, but his narrative was already working to reframe even that evidence to support his fabricated version of events. The defendant appeared to be conducting surveillance of the courthouse entrance. Sullivan continued, warming to his story. She was carrying what appeared to be stolen or forged legal documents, and her behavior suggested she was preparing to attempt some kind of fraud or security breach. Judge Kent leaned forward with interest, drawn into Sullivan's compelling narrative. What specifically made you suspicious, Officer Sullivan? Several factors, Your Honor. First, the defendant was dressed inappropriately for legitimate court business, but she was carrying an expensive briefcase that seemed inconsistent with her apparent socioeconomic status. Second, she was loitering near the courthouse entrance in a manner consistent with criminal reconnaissance. Each lie was carefully crafted to plant seeds of doubt, while reinforcing stereotypes that would make his story more believable. Sullivan had learned that successful police testimony wasn't just about facts. It was about creating a narrative that fit the audience's expectations and prejudices. When I approached to investigate, Sullivan continued, his voice taking on the tone of a patient professional dealing with an unreasonable subject, the defendant immediately became hostile and evasive. She refused to provide proper identification and began making increasingly aggressive demands to enter the courthouse. Evelyn's jaw clenched as she listened to each fabrication, each distortion of reality that transformed her polite request for entry into aggressive demands. But she remained silent, taking mental notes of every lie that would soon become evidence in Sullivan's federal prosecution. The defendant claimed to be a lawyer, then a judge, then said she worked in the building. Sullivan continued, his voice dripping with contempt. It's a classic deflection tactic we see from repeat offenders who think they can talk their way out of accountability. From the gallery, Officers Miller and Reed exchanged knowing looks. They had heard Sullivan tell variations of this story dozens of times before. Different faces, but the same essential narrative. The system always believed cops over criminals, especially when those criminals looked like Evelyn Monroe. What was the defendant's demeanor during this interaction? Prosecutor Hayes asked, setting up the foundation for the assault charges. Increasingly agitated and threatening. Your Honor, she kept insisting that I would regret stopping her, that I didn't know who I was dealing with. When I attempted to de-escalate the situation by explaining courthouse security procedures, she became physically aggressive. Sullivan paused for effect, letting the tension build in the courtroom. That's when she attempted to push past me into the building, and I was forced to use appropriate force to prevent her from breaching courthouse security. The lie was so audacious, so completely opposite to reality, that Evelyn almost admired Sullivan's commitment to his fabricated narrative. But she also knew that every word of his perjury was being recorded by the court's stenographer, creating a permanent legal record that would soon become crucial evidence in his federal prosecution. Sullivan had no idea that his confident testimony was actually digging his own grave deeper with every lie. Sullivan was hitting his stride now, his fabricated testimony flowing like a well-rehearsed performance. Years of successful prosecutions had taught him exactly which details to emphasize, which emotions to project, and which buttons to push to ensure that judges and juries accepted his version of events without question. Officer Sullivan, Prosecutor Hayes continued, "Can you describe the specific nature of the defendant's physical aggression?" "Absolutely, Your Honor. After the defendant realized that her verbal intimidation wasn't working, she escalated to physical violence. She swung her fist at my face, forcing me to block the attack with my defensive hand." Sullivan demonstrated the motion for the court, his movements precise and professional. What he was describing as defensive action was actually the brutal backhand that had left a purple bruise on Evelyn's cheek, but his confident presentation made his version seem credible. When I attempted to secure her hands for everyone's safety, she kicked at my legs and continued struggling violently. At that point, I realized I was dealing with someone who posed a genuine threat to courthouse security. Judge Kent nodded gravely, completely drawn into Sullivan's narrative. "What measures did you take to control the situation?" "I used the minimum force necessary to subdue the defendant's aggressive behavior, Your Honor. I secured her hands with department-issued restraints and immediately called for backup to ensure the safety of everyone in the area." Sullivan's lies were becoming more elaborate and more confident with each sentence. He had discovered years ago that the key to successful police testimony was commitment to the narrative, regardless of how far it diverged from reality. "I want to emphasize to the court," Sullivan continued, "that I showed remarkable restraint during this encounter. The defendant was clearly unstable, possibly under the influence of controlled substances. A less experienced officer might have used much more significant force to control her aggressive behavior." Evelyn almost smiled at the absurdity of Sullivan's claims. As a federal judge who had presided over hundreds of police misconduct cases, she recognized every element of his standard playbook. Claim victim was aggressive, emphasize officer restraint, suggest drug use without evidence, and present brutality as professional law enforcement. "Officer Sullivan," Judge Kent interjected, "in your professional opinion, what motivated the defendant's behavior?" Sullivan's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of question that allowed him to present his prejudices as professional expertise. "Your Honor, in my 12 years of law enforcement experience, I've encountered this pattern many times before. Certain individuals believe they're entitled to special treatment, that rules don't apply to them. When confronted with legitimate authority, they immediately resort to claims of discrimination or police brutality." His voice rose with righteous indignation, perfectly calibrated to appeal to the judge's sense of justice and order. "It's honestly insulting to the real victims of discrimination. Your Honor, this defendant is trying to weaponize serious social issues to deflect from her own criminal behavior. She knows that if she can make this about race rather than her actual crimes, she might be able to manipulate public sympathy." Several people in the gallery, mostly courthouse employees who had worked with Sullivan for years, nodded in agreement. His narrative felt familiar and comfortable, reinforcing their existing beliefs about crime, justice, and social order. Sullivan pulled out his phone, swiping to a video that conveniently started mid-confrontation. "I have partial footage here, Your Honor, though unfortunately my body camera experienced a technical malfunction this morning." The lie rolled off his tongue like honey. Sullivan had learned that claiming equipment malfunctions was often more believable than having no video evidence at all, and it allowed him to present carefully edited footage that supported his narrative while concealing his actual crimes. However, This cell phone video clearly shows the defendant's combative behavior and my professional response to her aggression. Evelyn knew that Sullivan's technical malfunction claim was completely false. She also knew that his body camera footage was automatically backed up to county servers every 60 seconds, regardless of any local equipment issues. But Sullivan was apparently unaware of the backup systems that would soon expose his lies. "Officer Miller," Prosecutor Hayes called. "Can you corroborate Officer Sullivan's testimony?" Officer Miller stood with military precision, his uniform immaculate and his expressions serious. "Yes, ma'am. I witnessed the entire incident from approximately 50 FT away." Officer Sullivan handled the situation with remarkable professionalism and restraint. Evelyn watched as the web of lies expanded, each supporting testimony, making Sullivan's eventual downfall more devastating. Miller had been one of the officers, laughing and recording on his phone while she was being brutalized. But now he was presenting himself as a credible witness to Sullivan's professionalism. The defendant was clearly attempting to circumvent security protocols. Miller continued with practiced authority. Her behavior was erratic and confrontational from the moment Officer Sullivan approached her. She seemed determined to gain access to restricted areas through intimidation and false claims. Judge Kent leaned forward attentively. "And the alleged assault on Officer Sullivan." "Your Honor, I personally observed the defendant swing at Officer Sullivan's face and attempt to kick him when he tried to secure her hands for everyone's safety. Officer Sullivan showed incredible restraint in dealing with such aggressive behavior. The systematic perjury was breathtaking in its scope and coordination. 3 police officers were now on record, under oath, telling coordinated lies about assaulting a federal judge. They had transformed their criminal assault into heroic law enforcement, their victim into a dangerous criminal, and their perjury into professional testimony. But Evelyn knew something they didn't. Every word of their false testimony was being recorded by the court's stenographer, creating a permanent legal record that would soon become crucial evidence in their federal prosecution for conspiracy, perjury, and civil rights violations. Officer Reed, Prosecutor Hayes called next, completing the triumvirate of perjury that would soon destroy 3 law enforcement careers simultaneously. "What did you observe regarding the defendant's alleged possession of fraudulent documents?" Officer Reed approached the witness stand with the same rehearsed confidence as his colleagues. At 28 years old, he was the youngest of the 3 officers, but he had quickly learned that supporting Sullivan's narratives was essential for career advancement within their department. "Your Honor, I can confirm everything my colleagues have testified to regarding the defendant's suspicious behavior and aggressive assault on Officer Sullivan," Reed began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been seriously questioned about his version of events. "But I want to focus specifically on the evidence that suggests this was a premeditated criminal conspiracy rather than a spontaneous incident." Judge Kent's eyebrows rose with interest. The suggestion of premeditation would significantly impact sentencing if Evelyn were convicted, potentially adding years to any prison term. The defendant was carrying what appeared to be a sophisticated collection of forged legal documents, Reed continued, gesturing toward the evidence table where Evelyn's briefcase contents had been displayed. Case files, judicial memoranda, administrative correspondence, materials that only court personnel would have legitimate access to. Evelyn wanted to laugh at the cosmic irony. Reed was describing her own case files, her own judicial orders, her own administrative correspondence as forged documents. The man was so ignorant of basic courthouse procedures that he couldn't recognize authentic judicial materials when they were directly in front of him. "In my professional opinion," Reed continued, "the defendant was clearly planning to impersonate court personnel or attempt some kind of sophisticated fraud scheme. The quality of these forgeries suggests significant resources and preparation." Sullivan nodded approvingly from the prosecutor's table. Reed was exceeding expectations, adding layers of criminality that would make Evelyn's situation even more desperate, and her eventual punishment more severe. "Officer Reed," Judge Kent interjected, "what specific elements of these documents aroused your suspicion?" Reed picked up one of Evelyn's authentic case files, holding it like contaminated evidence. "Your Honor, this document contains sensitive information about pending court cases, including confidential judicial deliberations and private attorney-client communications. No ordinary citizen would have access to materials like this." The document Reed was holding contained Evelyn's own handwritten notes from a case she had presided over the previous week. Her judicial seal was clearly visible on the letterhead. Her signature was authentic, and the case numbers corresponded to legitimate entries in the court's database. But Reed's prejudice made it impossible for him to recognize obvious signs of authenticity. He saw what he expected to see: a black woman with fraudulent documents rather than a federal judge with legitimate materials. "Furthermore," Reed continued, warming to his fabrication, "the defendant's behavior when confronted about these documents was consistent with someone who knew she was engaged in criminal activity. She became evasive when asked about their origin and refused to explain how she had obtained such sensitive materials. Evelyn had actually tried multiple times to explain that the documents were authentic and that she had legitimate access to them through her position as a federal judge. But Sullivan had refused to examine her credentials or listen to her explanations before initiating his assault. Comment your country and city. Let's see where justice is being celebrated worldwide. The sophistication of this fraud scheme, Reed concluded, suggests that the defendant may be part of a larger criminal organization targeting the judicial system. I recommend that this court consider the broader implications of her actions when determining appropriate punishment." Prosecutor Hayes smiled with satisfaction as she prepared to wrap up the state's case. The testimony had exceeded her expectations, painting a picture of a dangerous criminal who posed a significant threat to courthouse security and judicial integrity. "Your Honor," Hayes announced with confidence, "the state believes the evidence clearly demonstrates not just individual criminal behavior, but a coordinated attack on the foundations of our justice system." The defendant's attempt to frame this as a civil rights issue is obviously a calculated defense strategy designed to distract from the serious nature of her crimes. Sullivan allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. This was exactly how these cases were supposed to go. Professional police testimony, credible evidence, and a defendant who had no realistic defense against the combined authority of 3 sworn officers. "Officer Sullivan," Judge Kent said, "is there anything else you'd like to add to your testimony before we hear from the defendant?" Sullivan couldn't resist one final moment of triumph. He stood slowly, his chest puffed with righteous authority, and addressed the court with the confidence of someone who had never been held accountable for his actions. Just that incidents like this remind us why we need strong law enforcement. Your Honor, some people only understand authority when it's backed by force. The defendant learned today that actions have consequences, and I hope this court will send a clear message that attacks on law enforcement and the judicial system will not be tolerated. He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be, or that he had just delivered his own epitaph as a law enforcement officer. The trap was set. The lies were on record. And Evelyn Monroe was about to spring the most devastating reversal in courthouse history. "The state rests its case against this defendant," Prosecutor Hayes announced with supreme confidence. "The evidence clearly shows criminal trespass, assault on police officers, resisting arrest, and attempted fraud. We recommend the maximum penalty to send a clear message about the consequences of attacking law enforcement." As Sullivan stepped down from the witness stand, he caught Evelyn's eye one final time. The wink he gave her was a gesture of complete dominance, total victory, and absolute confidence that justice had been served. It would be the last moment of triumph in his entire career. Judge Kent adjusted his glasses and looked toward the defendant's table with the weary expression of someone preparing to hear desperate lies from a convicted criminal. The defendant may now present her statement, though I should note that the evidence against you appears quite substantial. Evelyn Monroe rose slowly from her chair, the handcuffs clinking softly as she moved. Despite the purple bruise on her cheek and the disheveled state of her clothes from Sullivan's assault, she carried herself with an unmistakable dignity that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably. Something about her presence was different from the typical defendants who appeared in this courtroom. Her posture was erect, but not defensive. Her expression was calm, but not resigned, and her voice carried an authority that seemed to fill the entire room. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said quietly, her words carrying a weight that made Judge Kent look up from his notes with sudden attention. "I appreciate the opportunity to address these allegations." There was something in her tone that was unexpected, professional in a way that didn't match the narrative he'd been presented. Her diction was precise, her grammar was flawless, and her bearing suggested someone who was comfortable addressing courts rather than being judged by them. "First," Evelyn continued, her voice taking on the measured cadence of someone completely familiar with legal proceedings, "I want to clarify several factual inaccuracies in Officer Sullivan's testimony." Her eyes swept the courtroom methodically, landing on each person who had supported the officer's lies. The quality of her speech, the precision of her language, the confidence in her bearing. Nothing matched the profile of the desperate criminal Sullivan had described. According to his statement, I was trespassing on government property. However, I was walking on a public sidewalk approaching the main entrance of this courthouse at approximately 8:47 a.m. She turned slightly, addressing Judge Kent directly with the kind of natural authority that made him lean forward unconsciously. "Your Honor, I'm sure you're familiar with the Supreme Court ruling in HEG versus Committee for Industrial Organization, which clearly establishes that public sidewalks adjacent to government buildings are traditional public forums where citizens have a constitutional right to be present." The court's stenographer's fingers paused mid-stroke. This wasn't the rambling emotional outburst they'd expected from someone facing serious criminal charges. Her citation was accurate, her legal reasoning was sound, and her delivery was that of someone who had spent years arguing constitutional law. Furthermore, Evelyn continued, "Officer Sullivan testified that I was carrying suspicious documents and suggested I was involved in identity theft. I'd like to examine that claim more closely." She gestured toward the evidence table where her scattered papers had been collected, her movement graceful, despite the handcuffs that restricted her motion. "Those documents are indeed authentic legal materials. Specifically, they include pending case files, judicial memoranda, and administrative correspondence, all of which I have legitimate access to in my professional capacity." Judge Kent's expression was shifting from dismissive to concerned. "Professional capacity? And what exactly is your profession, miss?" Evelyn paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth that made Sullivan feel the first chill of genuine fear creeping down his spine. "Monroe. Ms. Monroe. And I think we'll get to my professional background shortly, Your Honor." The confidence in her voice, the legal terminology she was using with perfect precision, the way she carried herself despite the handcuffs, nothing was matching Sullivan's assumptions about who she was supposed to be. "Oh, Your Honor, if I may continue," Evelyn said, her voice taking on the unmistakable authority of someone who had spent decades giving orders in courtrooms rather than receiving them. "Officer Sullivan also testified that I became verbally aggressive and used profanity during our encounter." She paused, letting the tension build in the silent courtroom. "I'd like to address that claim by invoking my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent regarding any statements I may have made during the alleged incident. However, I will note that any statements I did make were in direct response to being physically assaulted without provocation, warning, or legal justification." The young law clerk in the back row sat up straighter. Something about this woman's voice, her mannerisms, her natural command of legal procedure seemed familiar in a way that was making her increasingly uncomfortable. Now, regarding Officer Sullivan's claim that his body camera malfunctioned, Evelyn continued. And now there was steel in her voice that made several court officers shift nervously. Your Honor, I'm sure you're aware of the federal rules of evidence, particularly Rule 106, which allows for the introduction of comprehensive summaries when dealing with voluminous electronic records. Judge Kent was leaning forward now, his expression shifting from routine boredom to deep concern as he began to realize this was not a typical case. I have reason to believe that comprehensive video and audio evidence of this morning's incident exists and will be made available to this court through proper legal channels. Sullivan's face was beginning to lose color. His confident smirk was fading as he started to understand that something was going very wrong with what should have been a routine conviction. What kind of evidence are you referring to? Judge Kent asked, his voice tight with growing apprehension. Evelyn's eyes gleamed with something that looked like barely contained satisfaction. Your Honor, this courthouse has extensive security camera coverage, including high-definition digital cameras positioned at 15 FT intervals along the main approach, all connected to centralized recording systems with automatic backup protocols. Sullivan felt his stomach drop as he realized he had completely forgotten about the courthouse security cameras in his rush to control the narrative through false testimony. Additionally, Evelyn continued with devastating precision. The county maintains automatic backup systems for all officer body camera footage uploaded to secure cloud storage every 60 seconds, regardless of any claimed local equipment malfunctions. Her voice was taking on the tone of someone delivering a lecture on legal procedure to students who should have known better. I would like to formally request that this court issue an immediate preservation order for all electronic surveillance data from this morning between 8:45 and 9:15 a.m., including but not limited to courthouse security footage, officer body camera backup files, and any mobile phone recordings that may have been made by law enforcement personnel present at the scene. Prosecutor Hayes stood abruptly, her confidence evaporating as she realized the case was spiraling beyond her control. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant cannot simply make evidentiary demands without proper legal representation. Evelyn turned to face the prosecutor with a look that made Hayes take an involuntary step backward. There was something in Evelyn's eyes that suggested she was far more dangerous than anyone in the courtroom had realized. Your Honor, proceed defendants have the fundamental constitutional right to present evidence in their own defense under the Sixth Amendment to the United States Constitution. Additionally, Brady v. Maryland clearly establishes the prosecution's affirmative obligation to preserve potentially exculpatory evidence. The silence in the courtroom was becoming deafening. This was not how these cases usually proceeded. Furthermore, Evelyn continued, her voice gaining strength and authority with each word, Gigloff, United States requires the disclosure of any evidence that might impeach the credibility of prosecution witnesses, particularly law enforcement officers, who may have provided false testimony under oath. Judge Kent cleared his throat nervously. Miss Monroe, you seem unusually familiar with complex legal procedure and constitutional law. Do you have formal legal training? Evelyn's smile was becoming more pronounced, though it didn't reach her eyes. I have some experience with the judicial system, Your Honor. Her response was carefully neutral, but her eyes gleamed with something that looked almost like amusement at the cosmic irony of the situation. She walked as much as the handcuffs would allow to the evidence table and gestured toward her scattered belongings, with the kind of natural authority that made everyone in the courtroom unconsciously defer to her movements. Your Honor, I'd also like to address Officer Sullivan's characterization of my presence at this courthouse as suspicious or unauthorized. Evelyn pointed to a specific document among the papers scattered on the evidence table, her movement precise, despite the restraints limiting her mobility. "This is my daily court calendar, which clearly shows I was scheduled to preside over. Excuse me. I was scheduled to appear in this building for legitimate judicial business, starting at 9 a.m. this morning." Bailiff Morgan, a large man who had worked in this courthouse for 15 years, suddenly went very still. He was staring at Evelyn with growing recognition and horror, his face turning ashen as the implications of what he was witnessing began to sink in. "Officer Sullivan testified that I claimed to be someone important," Evelyn continued, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to controlling courtroom proceedings. "I'd like to clarify that I never made any such specific claims during our brief encounter." She paused, surveying the courtroom with the kind of commanding presence that made everyone unconsciously straighten in their seats. "However, I did attempt repeatedly to show Officer Sullivan my official identification, which he refused to examine before initiating his unprovoked physical assault." Sullivan was sweating now, his confident demeanor cracking as he began to realize that something was going terribly wrong with what should have been a routine case resulting in an easy conviction. "Your Honor," Evelyn said, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering crucial information to a court, "I have in my possession, despite Officer Sullivan's violent interference, documentation that will conclusively establish both my true identity and my completely legitimate reason for being at this courthouse this morning." The tension in the room was becoming unbearable. Everyone could sense that they were witnessing something unprecedented, though most didn't yet understand exactly what was happening. Judge Kent was beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable. "What specific kind of documentation are you referring to?" Evelyn reached carefully into her jacket pocket, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid startling anyone in the increasingly tense courtroom. "My official judicial parking pass issued by this courthouse's administrative office and updated annually. My building access card programmed with my personal judicial chamber's entry code and biometric security clearance, and my federal judicial identification." Bailiff Morgan suddenly stood up, his face pale as he recognized the woman he'd seen every single day for the past 5 years, walking these same halls, entering the same chambers, presiding over the same courtroom where she now sat as a defendant. "Your Honor," Evelyn said quietly, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone used to giving orders in courtrooms rather than taking them. "I believe there's been a significant misunderstanding about who exactly Officer Sullivan assaulted this morning." She held up a leather credential wallet, and even from across the room, the gold federal judicial seal was clearly visible to everyone in the courtroom. "Perhaps we should recess so that proper identifications can be verified through official channels," she suggested, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had made similar procedural suggestions thousands of times before. Judge Kent stared at the credential wallet, then at Evelyn's face, then at Bailiff Morgan, who was nodding grimly in confirmation of his worst fears. The color had completely drained from Sullivan's face as he began to understand the magnitude of what he had done. His hands were shaking, his breathing was becoming labored, and his career was flashing before his eyes. "Court will recess for 15 minutes, Judge Kent said hoarsely, his voice barely audible in the stunned silence. As the gavel fell with a sound like thunder, Sullivan felt his entire world beginning to crumble around him. Whatever game he thought he was playing, he was beginning to realize he might not have understood the rules at all. During the 15-minute recess, the courthouse buzzed with nervous energy that spread like wildfire through every corridor, office, and chamber. Word traveled in whispers at first, then in increasingly frantic phone calls and urgent text messages. In a small holding room adjacent to the courtroom, Evelyn sat calmly while Bailiff Morgan fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking as the full reality of the situation hit him like a physical blow. "Judge Monroe," he whispered, his voice thick with horror and disbelief. "Jesus Christ, Judge Monroe, I am so sorry. I didn't recognize you in civilian clothes. And when they brought you in like that?" His voice trailed off as he struggled to comprehend how the respected federal judge he'd worked with for years had ended up handcuffed in a holding cell. "It's all right, Morgan," Evelyn replied softly, her voice carrying the same gentle authority he'd heard in her courtroom countless times. "You weren't part of Officer Sullivan's assault, but I need you to do something very important for me. Anything, Your Honor. Absolutely anything at all." Evelyn looked him directly in the eye, with the kind of steady gaze that had intimidated countless defendants over her 23-year career. "I need you to go to my chambers quietly and bring me my judicial robes, the black ones with the gold trim that I wear for formal proceedings." She paused for emphasis. "And Morgan, bring my ceremonial gavel too, the engraved one from my federal appointment ceremony." Morgan nodded vigorously and hurried out, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts as she prepared for the most important judicial proceeding of her entire career. Morgan returned carrying a garment bag and a small wooden box, his face still pale with shock and barely controlled anger at what had been done to the judge he'd served faithfully for years. "Your robes, Your Honor. Hand your ceremonial gavel." Evelyn stood and unzipped the garment bag with deliberate care, revealing the flowing black judicial robes that had been her armor and authority for over 2 decades. As she slipped them on over her civilian clothes, she felt the profound transformation begin. The fabric settled on her shoulders like a mantle of constitutional authority. Each fold was a reminder of the power she wielded, the oath she had taken, the justice she was sworn to protect and deliver. The weight of the robes was familiar and comforting, transforming her from Sullivan's victim back into the embodiment of federal judicial power. She opened the wooden box and lifted out her ceremonial gavel, its familiar weight settling into her hand like an extension of her will. Engraved on its polished handle with the word she had chosen 23 years ago during her appointment ceremony. "Justice is blind, but she sees all." "Morgan," she said, adjusting her robes with the practiced movements of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. "When we return to that courtroom, I want you to announce me with full judicial protocol." "Yes, Your Honor. How would you like the announcement?" Evelyn Monroe straightened to her full height, every inch the federal judge she had been for the past 23 years. The bruise on her cheek from Sullivan's assault was still visible. But now it served a different purpose entirely. It wasn't just evidence of his brutality. It was a symbol of how far the system had fallen and how completely it was about to be restored. "The Honorable Judge Evelyn Monroe presiding," she said with quiet but absolute authority. She looked at herself in the small mirror on the wall, watching the complete transformation from victim to judge. The woman looking back at her was no longer Sullivan's target. She was justice itself, and justice was about to deliver its verdict. Meanwhile, in the main courtroom, Sullivan sat slumped in his chair, his uniform wrinkled and his face ashen as the reality of his situation began to sink in. His fellow officers, Miller and Reed, were whispering urgently among themselves, their confident smirks replaced by expressions of growing panic. Prosecutor Hayes was frantically making phone calls, trying to understand how a routine assault case had spiraled so completely beyond her control. Her carefully constructed prosecution was collapsing in real time, and she had no idea how to salvage the situation. The gallery was filling with courthouse employees, lawyers, and court staff who had heard whispers of something unprecedented happening. News traveled fast in the insular world of the federal courthouse, and everyone wanted to witness what promised to be a historic moment. Chief Judge Eleanor Vance had quietly entered and taken a seat in the front row, her expression grim as she prepared to document what she knew would be one of the most significant judicial proceedings in the courthouse's history. Sullivan's hands were shaking as he contemplated the destruction of everything he had worked for over 12 years of police service. His pension, his reputation, his freedom, all hanging by a thread because he had chosen to assault the one person who had the power to destroy him completely. "When court resumes," Evelyn told Morgan as she made final adjustments to her robes, "Officer Sullivan will learn what accountability really means." The bailiff's voice would soon boom through that courtroom with an authority that would make everyone snap to attention. But what happened next would be seared into their memories forever. A moment when the entire balance of power shifted in the most dramatic way possible. Sullivan was about to discover that his victim was actually his judge, jury, and executioner, all rolled into one. And she had 23 years of experience in delivering justice to people exactly like him. Her phone returned during the recess, buzzed with missed calls and messages. Chief Judge Vance had alerted the FBI Civil Rights Division. The Attorney General's office had been notified. Federal investigators were already en route to secure evidence and begin what would become the largest police corruption case in the state's history. But first, Evelyn had some personal business to attend to. Sullivan had humiliated her, assaulted her, and tried to destroy her reputation through perjury. Now she was going to show him exactly what happened when someone attacked the very foundation of the justice system. The reckoning was about to begin, and it would be swift, thorough, and absolutely devastating. Morgan straightened his own uniform and prepared to deliver the announcement that would change everything. In moments, the most powerful police officer in the courthouse would become the most powerless defendant, and the woman he had brutalized would become his judge. Justice was about to be served, and it was going to be perfect. "All rise." Morgan's voice boomed through the courtroom with an authority that made everyone snap to attention immediately. The packed gallery rose as one. But what happened next would be seared into their memories forever. Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Evelyn Monroe presiding. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt of divine justice. Officer Sullivan, who had been leaning casually against the prosecutor's table, went rigid, as if struck by lightning. Judge Kent, still seated in what he now realized was not his chair, turned pale as death and began frantically gathering his papers. Prosecutor Hayes's mouth fell open in shock, her carefully prepared case files scattering to the floor as the full magnitude of the situation crashed over her like a tidal wave. Evelyn Monroe entered through the judge's chamber door, wearing her full judicial robes with the gold trim catching the overhead lights. She moved with the measured, majestic pace of someone who had walked this path thousands of times before, her ceremonial gavel held firmly in her right hand. The silence was absolutely complete. Not a single person in the packed courtroom dared to breathe. She took her place behind the bench, her bench, and sat down slowly, deliberately, with the kind of controlled dignity that made everyone understand they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of American jurisprudence. Her eyes swept the courtroom methodically, taking in every shocked face, every dropped jaw, every person who was finally beginning to understand the cosmic magnitude of what had just happened. "Officer Sullivan," she said quietly, her voice carrying the full weight of federal judicial authority that had been building for 23 years. "You may remain standing." Sullivan looked like he was about to vomit, faint, or both simultaneously. His face had gone from red to white to green in the span of 30 seconds. Sweat beading on his forehead as his entire life crashed down around him. "Your Honor," Judge Kent stammered, rising from his chair with the desperate urgency of someone trying to escape a natural disaster. We didn't, I mean to say." "Judge Kent," Evelyn interrupted, her tone crisp but not unkind. "Thank you for managing my courtroom during my unexpected delay. You may return to your own docket immediately. I'll handle this matter from here." Kent practically ran from the courtroom, his robes billowing behind him as if he were being chased by the very embodiment of justice itself. Evelyn turned her attention back to Sullivan, who was now visibly shaking. his legs barely able to support his weight, as the full horror of his situation became undeniably clear. "Officer Sullivan," she continued, her voice steady and controlled with the precision of someone who had delivered thousands of verdicts. "Approximately 2 hours ago, you testified under oath in this courtroom. Do you recall your testimony?" Sullivan's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air, no sound emerging from his paralyzed vocal cords. "Let me refresh your memory," Evelyn continued with devastating calm. "Since every word you spoke was recorded by our court stenographer and is now part of the permanent legal record, she pulled out a transcript that had been prepared during the recess. Her movements deliberate and controlled. You stated, and I quote, "Exactly. These people always claim to be lawyers, judges, senators, anything to avoid accountability. Do you remember saying that under oath, Officer Sullivan?" Sullivan nodded weakly, his legs shaking so violently he could barely remain standing. "You also testified that I was, and I quote, another welfare queen looking for a handout, and that you had seen, and I quote, this playbook before. Is that accurate?" The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like the roar of an approaching storm. Evelyn's voice grew colder, more precise, carrying the weight of constitutional authority that could destroy lives with a single word. "And perhaps most memorably, Officer Sullivan, you stated under oath that people like me need to learn that, and I quote your exact words, actions have consequences. Do you recall that particular piece of wisdom?" Sullivan's knees buckled slightly, and he had to grab onto the prosecutor's table to keep from collapsing entirely. Evelyn reached under her bench and pulled out a tablet computer, her movements deliberate and methodical. The technology represented the difference between Sullivan's old world of unchecked authority and the new reality of absolute accountability. "Officer Sullivan, I'd like to show you some evidence that has come to my attention during our brief recess." She turned the tablet screen toward the courtroom, and Sullivan's world exploded into 1,000,000 pieces. This is footage from courthouse security camera number 7, which maintains an unobstructed high-definition view of our main entrance, recording continuously to secure digital storage. The courtroom watched in absolute horror as the morning's events unfolded on screen with crystal clarity. There was Evelyn walking calmly toward the courthouse in her civilian clothes, carrying her briefcase with professional dignity. There was Sullivan, emerging like a predator to block her path. "Look what we got here. Another welfare queen trying to sneak into places she don't belong." His voice, clear as crystal, filled the courtroom through the tablet speakers, and several people gasped audibly at the naked hatred in his words. The video continued with horrifying clarity, showing Sullivan's unprovoked assault in vivid, undeniable detail. Every person in the courtroom watched as his open palm cracked across Evelyn's face with such force that her head snapped sideways. The sound of the impact was clearly audible, making several spectators wince with sympathetic pain. "Officer Sullivan," Evelyn said, pausing the video at the moment of impact. "Do you see any verbal aggression from the defendant in this footage? Any profanity? Any threats that would justify this assault?" Sullivan remained silent, his career and life disintegrating before his eyes with each passing second. "Let's continue watching," Evelyn said, resuming the video. The courtroom witnessed Sullivan grabbing Evelyn's throat and slamming her against the courthouse wall with brutal force. "Scum like you has no business in a house of justice." Sullivan's own words, spoken with venom and hatred, echoed through the courtroom like a death knell for his career. Several courthouse employees stood up and walked out in disgust, unable to watch any more of the systematic brutality. "Now," Evelyn continued with devastating precision, "let's examine your claim that your body camera malfunctioned this morning." She swiped to a new video file, and Sullivan's face went completely white. "This is backup footage from your own body camera, automatically uploaded to our county's secure cloud storage system every 60 seconds. A system you apparently forgot existed, Officer Sullivan. The new video began playing, and Sullivan's voice filled the courtroom again. But this time, the audio was even more damning because it captured his private thoughts and motivations. "Look at this uppity thinking she can just walk into my courthouse." Sullivan's voice snarled through the speakers. "These people need to learn their place. Time to teach another lesson." The systematic racism in his private commentary was breathtaking in its openness and brutality. This wasn't just excessive force. It was a hate crime captured in perfect digital clarity. "Officer Miller, Officer Reed," Evelyn called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just witnessed perjury committed in her own courtroom. "You both testified under oath that Officer Sullivan handled this situation with remarkable professionalism. Would you like to revise those statements now?" Both officers were already edging toward the exit, their confident testimonies revealed as obvious perjury by the video evidence. "And here," Evelyn said, advancing the footage to show Sullivan's assault from his own body camera perspective. "We can clearly observe the moment when Officer Sullivan committed felony assault against a federal judge while she was attempting to perform her constitutional duties." She let those words hang in the air for a long moment, each syllable carrying the weight of federal law. Federal Judge Officer Sullivan, not a welfare queen, not a criminal, not a trespasser, a federal judge appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the United States Senate. Sullivan's knees finally gave out completely, and he collapsed into the prosecutor's chair, his body shaking with the magnitude of his realization. "But wait," Evelyn said, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone that made the tension even more unbearable. "There's additional evidence I'd like the court to consider." She pulled up a new file on her tablet, and Sullivan knew his destruction was about to become even more complete. "This is audio from Officer Reed's body camera, which apparently was functioning perfectly this morning, while yours was allegedly malfunctioning." A new voice filled the courtroom, Officer Miller speaking to Reed while Sullivan was assaulting Evelyn. "Dude's really going off on this one. Think she's actually somebody important like she keeps saying?" Reed's voice responded with casual cruelty. "Now, man, look at her. Sullivan knows what he's doing. Probably just another welfare case trying to scam the system." More laughter from the officers as they watched their colleague brutalize a federal judge, their conversation revealing the casual racism that permeated their entire approach to law enforcement. The few remaining spectators in the gallery were staring at Sullivan with undisguised revulsion. The man they had once respected as a law enforcement professional was being revealed as a criminal and a racist whose actions had brought shame upon the entire justice system. "Officer Sullivan," Evelyn said, setting down her tablet with finality, "you asked me earlier if I had any employment verification to prove my right to be in this courthouse." She gestured to the federal judicial seal mounted on the wall behind her bench, then to her nameplate, then to the oil painting of her that hung in the courthouse lobby. "Well, I do have employment verification. I've been the presiding federal judge of this courthouse for 23 years, Officer Sullivan. Every case you've ever testified in, every warrant you've ever requested, every search you've ever conducted in this jurisdiction has been under my direct constitutional authority." Sullivan finally found his voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Your Honor, I didn't know." Evelyn's eyes flashed with controlled fury. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to look, Officer Sullivan. You saw a black woman and you made assumptions based on your own prejudice and hatred." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but carrying enough authority to fill the entire courtroom. "But there's something else you didn't know, Officer Sullivan." The courtroom held its collective breath. "For the past 8 months," Evelyn continued, her voice gaining strength and authority with each word, I have been conducting a comprehensive federal investigation into patterns of misconduct and racial bias in this police department, working directly with the FBI's Civil Rights Division and the Department of Justice. Sullivan's face went completely ashen as the full scope of his situation became clear. This morning's incident wasn't random. Officer Sullivan, you have been under federal surveillance and you just provided us with the most perfect, unambiguous, undeniable evidence of criminal civil rights violations that any prosecutor could hope for. She lifted her ceremonial gavel and held it before her, the engraved words, "Justice is blind, but she sees all catching the courtroom lights." Officer Sullivan, you said that actions have consequences. You were absolutely right about that. Evelyn stood, her judicial robes flowing around her as she prepared to deliver the most important verdict of her career. Based on the evidence presented in this courtroom, evidence that came from your own mouth, your own actions, your own camera, I find you guilty of assault in the first degree, a felony carrying a maximum sentence of 15 years in state prison. The words hit Sullivan like physical blows, each charge destroying another piece of his future. I find you guilty of assault on a federal judicial officer, a federal felony carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in federal prison. Sullivan's attorney, hastily summoned during the recess, closed his eyes and put his head in his hands, already calculating the decades his client would spend behind bars. I find you guilty of deprivation of civil rights under color of law, a federal felony punishable by up to life in prison when the violation involves attempted kidnapping and assault. With each pronouncement, Sullivan seemed to shrink further into his chair, the weight of federal justice crushing him completely. And I find you guilty of perjury in the first degree for your systematic false testimony given under oath in this very courtroom. Evelyn paused, letting the weight of those charges settle over the room like a suffocating blanket. But Officer Sullivan, this case was never really about you personally. You are simply a symptom of a much larger disease that has infected our justice system for far too long. She turned to address the packed gallery, her voice rising with the passion of someone who had dedicated her life to constitutional justice. For too long, we have allowed police officers to operate with complete impunity. For too long, we have dismissed complaints, ignored evidence, and paid settlements while allowing the abuse to continue unchecked. For too long, we have told victims of police brutality that their experiences don't matter, that their word doesn't count, that justice isn't for them. Her voice filled every corner of the courtroom with righteous authority. But that systematic failure ends today. What happened in this courtroom proves beyond any doubt that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law. Not police officers, not prosecutors, not judges, not politicians, no one. Sullivan suddenly broke down completely, his body shaking with sobs that echoed through the silent courtroom. "I'm sorry," he whispered through his tears. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know. I never meant for this to happen." Evelyn looked down at him with something that might have been pity, but her voice remained firm and uncompromising. "Officer Sullivan, your apology is 23 years and countless victims too late. Your remorse is only appearing now because you finally got caught by someone with the power to hold you accountable for your actions." She lifted her gavel high above her head, the symbol of justice preparing to fall. "But here's what I want you to understand. In your final moments as a free man, every person you brutalized over the years deserved the same justice I'm delivering today. Every grandmother you called racial slurs, every teenager you planted drugs on, every professional you arrested for existing in the wrong neighborhood. They all deserve to see you held accountable." The gavel hovered in the air as Evelyn delivered her final words. "Today, I'm not just delivering justice for myself. I'm delivering justice for every person whose complaints were dismissed as unsubstantiated. I'm delivering justice for every family who had to watch their loved ones get brutalized while the system looked the other way. Her voice reached its crescendo, filling the courtroom with the power of constitutional authority. "Officer Sullivan, you told me this morning to know my place. Well, let me tell you exactly what my place is. My place is ensuring that bullies like you can never again hide behind a badge while destroying innocent lives." The gavel came down with a sound like the crack of thunder, final and absolute. "Officer Sullivan, you are hereby sentenced to the maximum penalty allowed by federal law. You will serve 35 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole." The courtroom erupted in applause that lasted for 5 full minutes. Justice had finally been served, swift and complete. 6 months later, the ripple effects continued transforming the entire justice system. Sullivan served his sentence while his fellow officers faced federal charges. The department was placed under federal oversight. Body cameras became mandatory with tamper-proof backup systems, and Evelyn's courage inspired a new generation of civil rights advocates. Most importantly, the courthouse where it all happened was renamed the Justice Monroe Federal Courthouse, with a bronze plaque commemorating the morning that changed everything. Here, justice finally found its voice. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and shared your locations. Your support for accountability makes stories like this possible. Hit like if you believe everyone deserves justice. Subscribe for more incredible tales of courage triumphing over corruption. And share this story because truth always finds a way.